Hello and welcome to the third part of our lecture on the scientific method. In this third part, we will zoom into the scientific method a bit more. We will discuss the theoretical, philosophical, simplified version of the scientific method that we introduced up until now, and we will compare it to how science is actually done in reality. And by doing that, we will introduce a more elaborate model for the scientific method, a more realistic model that corresponds to reality in a better manner. Now, seeing science as a method is seeing science as a technique. And science, in fact, is also a technique. It's a logical problem solving technique that always starts with a good research question. And as we said before, science has many shapes and forms. It's a scientific discipline, it's a professional discipline, and it's also a culture of people doing science. But there's always one general idea at its basis, and that is the way we do science. The way we do science is very determining in our definition of what science is and demarcating science from non-science. And this is something that has occupied the philosophy of science for many years, for many decades, or even many centuries. And a very important concept to describe the way we do science is actually the scientific method. Now, up till now, we introduce a theoretical model for the scientific method that starts with the observation of an event. This triggers your curiosity and you start developing a model or a hypothesis to explain the event, and you make a prediction based on the hypothesis, based on this model to test. So you think of an experiment which you will do to prove your hypothesis, and then you start actually testing this prediction and observe the results. Now, sometimes it ends right there, and you accept your hypotheses and you build new knowledge. Very often the data contradicts your hypothesis a little bit, and you have to revise and your hypothesis and repeat your experiments if needed. The ultimate goal for a scientific method in this case is to turn valid hypotheses into scientific theories. So build knowledge, build an understanding of a certain phenomenon, and create theories that explain the thing you want to research. Now, in reality, the scientific method is a little bit more complex. It consists out of four main blocks, being exploration and discovery, testing IDs. These two are a bit similar to what we discussed before, but also benefits and outcomes, and community analysis and feedback. And rather it being more like a stepwise procedure with a small repeatable cycle at the end, each of these four branches influences one another, and there's a sort of feedback mechanism between these different branches, these different components of the scientific method throughout the whole process. Now, if we zoom in on the first branch, the first component of our scientific method, we see that exploration and discovery is kind of similar to what we saw already in the simplified model. It's about making observations, exploring literature, asking questions, and finding inspiration in other people's data and IDs. So by sharing data and IDs, we create a fundamental understanding of the knowledge that's already there. Now, this is not in reality, this is not really a process that is as theoretical as it was in the simplified version, and there's often a lot of external influences, such as new technology being developed by other people, a practical problem that rises, just your curiosity that kicks in, serendipity, you're studying something else, and just by accidents you notice something that is weird that you don't really understand, but it's interesting to study. It can also be personal motivation or a surprising observation, which is kind of the same as serendipity, but it's very much influenced by external factors. The second branch of the scientific method is also included in the simplified version, is about testing IDs. Like we said before, you have a potential explanation that you will test in the form of a hypothesis. You make a prediction in terms of like you design an experiment and you think about what the results might look like if your hypothesis turns out to be true or when your hypothesis turns out to be false. Then you actually do the testing, you gather the data and you analyze the results and observations and compare them to what you expected them to be. So you start interpreting your data. These data can be either supportive, so in favor of the hypothesis, contradictory, but also surprising. Sometimes, like I said, serendipity, they can lead you into a totally different path, or they might be inconclusive, very hard to interpret. Whatever's the case, there are four potential outcomes. Either you support the hypotheses or you reject or oppose the hypotheses. Now, what happens very often is when data oppose a hypothesis is that you start revising the hypothesis, or if the data is too contradictory, you have to design new hypotheses or at least a different interpretation, a different assumption made within your hypotheses. The other two parts of the scientific method in reality differ a bit from our simplified theoretical model. Very important in science, especially nowadays, and especially as our society keeps on developing, are the benefits and outcomes. Like in the original model, we have a very philosophical interpretation of the scientific method, and it's all about building new knowledge, satisfying our curiosity. But in real life, what is very often very important are the more practical applications of the knowledge, addressing societal issues, solving everyday problems, or just developing technology to make life a little bit more easy. Also very important, obviously, in in this in these times of a worldwide health crisis is to inform policy, to make policymakers aware of the scientific principles behind the crisis and inform them on how to infer policy onto the people. Another important part of the scientific method that we already discussed is the community analysis and feedback. So actually the people doing the science. We talked about feedback and peer review and publication and how that is very important in science and how that is a control mechanism for quality on the one hand, but also creates bias on the other hand. Along with replication, this control mechanism should, in the end, netto give a positive effect on the quality of how you do science, but also gives you an idea on how to interpret your results. So it gives you a new viewpoint on your own results, and this enables you to continue research further. Discussion with colleagues is very important and is a very essential part of peer review in this way. But in addition to peer review, you also analyze your results along with colleagues that write the article with you, but also colleagues which you collaborate with that might read your article after it's been published and might give you new ideas, might inspire you to come up with new questions, new ideas to do new research, and eventually gather new knowledge about the topic you're researching and build your theory in a more extensive and more complete manner. And although this model is already very elaborate and very realistic on how science is done nowadays, the actual influence of the community is even bigger than just community analysis and feedback. And what that means, we will discuss in the last two parts of the lecture.